Thank you so much for coming this evening. And I'm Yuki Miyamoto, professor in the Department of Religious Studies, and I'm also the director of DePaul Humanities Center. I'm delighted to be working today with Dr. Ron Zwigenberg from Penn State University, alongside my colleagues, Dr. Maureen Seo from Geography, Dr. Ola Glansman from Psychology, and Linda Tuck, a PhD student in Psychology. First, I'll ask Ron to give a half-an-hour talk about his latest book, which will be followed by the panelists' presentations and conversations among Ron and panelists. We will conclude the event with questions from the floor. We have some freshmen back in the room. Please enjoy the casual conversation with guest speaker and the panelists after the event. So let me briefly introduce Dr. Ron Zwigenberg. He is associate professor at Pennsylvania State University. His research focuses on modern Japanese and European history, with a specialization in memory and intellectual history. He has taught and lectured in the United States, Europe, Israel, and Japan, and published on issues of war memory, atomic energy, psychiatry, heritage, regionalism, and survivor politics. Along with his many articles, I have had the pleasure of reading and even reviewing both of Ron's monographs. His first book, The Origins of Global Memory Culture, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2014. I was fascinated by its exploration of how Hiroshima has leveraged its atomic bomb experience as a form of cultural currency. The book won the 2016 Association for Asian Studies John W. Hall Book Award. His latest book, Nuclear Mines, Cold War Psychological Science, and the Bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, was published last year by the University of Chicago Press. While it focuses on the psychological aftermath of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima, it also places the fields of social science and science within the geopolitical context of the Cold War, examining how academic studies are influenced or even shaped by such conditions. In addition to geopolitical conditions, Ron demonstrates the cultural differences and dynamics that influenced how both researchers and bomb survivors understood their symptoms before the concept of post-traumatic stress disorder was formally recognized. So now, let us welcome Dr. Ron Zwigenberg.
Thank you, Yuki. Thank you for this great introduction and for the summary of both my single monograph. I'm going to talk for about half an hour, maybe even a little bit less, because, one second. And give you an overview of nuclear mines, Cold War Psychological Science, and the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But I'm not going to focus on everything. I'm going to focus mostly on the psychological aspects, given the conversation we're going to have later on. I mean, it's all about psychology, but mostly about a psychologist that worked in Japan. Now, the book opens actually with something that I also covered in my first book, which is a meeting that happened in 1962 between two people. One very famous, at least in the history of psychology, Robert Lifton, an American psychiatrist, and one that is completely unknown, Kubo Ishitoshi, a professor in Hiroshima University in Japan. Now, the meeting was not a very successful one. When Lifton left the meeting, he wrote to his friend, David Risman, that he quite didn't understand what Kubo was about and what he wanted. It was a complete mismatch. But the meeting inspired Lifton to go back to stay in Hiroshima, to to stay in Hiroshima and start on a project that will eventually lead him to sit on a committee that defined PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome, about 20 years afterwards in the US. When he came back, he wrote, when he came out, he writes to his friend that what struck me most forcibly was that 17 years after such a tragic turning point in human history, no one had attempted a comprehensive psychological study of what had occurred in Hiroshima. And this sentence really bothered me. Why? Because we have an American coming to Hiroshima telling Japanese that how to do things, and how come he would even know? He doesn't speak Japanese, right? He spoke to one Japanese psychologist. So the book initially was trying to figure out what happened in those 17 years. What was happening in Japan? What was happening before Lifton intervention? Lifton, again, became a very, very important figure in the history of PTSD. He is responsible, and we're going to talk about it later, in many ways to bring up research on Holocaust, on Vietnam veterans, and for the rise of what he called in an interview that I had with him, victim-focused post-disaster psychiatry. And I'm going to explain that about later on what's so important about the victim-focused part. Lifton works, and what came together with PTSD, actually, you can see the coming together of various survivor trajectories, where Hiroshima was an important one, but also, again, Holocaust, Vietnam, victims of domestic violence, victims of violence against people who are activists, and the like. And this basically post-60s coming together through activism of psychiatrists that led to PTSD and led to the medicalization of psychological pain, which is, what I argue in the book, is a new phenomenon. The book cover four main arguments, right? And I'm going to cover about 2 or 3 of them only today. I'm going to completely skip the first one, right? The first one concerned the empire trauma and the problem of denial. And what I mean by that, I'm going to go back to the others in a second, that our understanding of psychological pain, understanding of disaster and what it does to human psyche is completely dominated by the idea of trauma, right? Taking the very apt phrase, right, the title of Didier Fassin and Richard Lechman book, The Empire of Trauma, I basically argued that the empire of trauma is dominating everything we think about suffering, and we have to think about it differently across time and across space. Because before people had a category of trauma, before people had a category of PTSD, they not just thought about this differently, they experienced it differently. Also, different cultures, non-Western cultures, experience pain, deal with pain differently. That we cannot take in a sort of cultural imperialism, take our own categories and impose it uncritically across space and time. And in making this argument, I rely on philosophy of science, Ian Hacking, to talk about the looping effect. That once you have the category, right, you have novel forms of experience, new ways to relate to one world, and new ways of thinking and expression that kind of work to reinforce the category, right? So once people had the idea of trauma, they start understanding what they went through as trauma, right? So if you think about what happened before trauma, it's not a form and the fact that people did not, quote unquote, saw trauma. It's not that they denied victim suffering. They just were unable to see it because the historic experiences, the way that they experienced the world, their position in history made them unable to see what we now see as trauma, given that we have the concept. So as after established theoretical framework, let me completely skip the second argument, which is about bombing and morale, which we can go back to it later if you want, right? And go to the third argument, which is about objectivity, right? So just very briefly about morale, don't think I leave you in the dark, right? when I started looking what happened in the 17 years before, I actually I realized I have to go way beyond that, because the first people that went on the ground in Hiroshima were not actually Japanese psychiatrists and psychologists, but American psychologists that worked for the American Air Force, well, United States Army Air Force, that went to see if we did a good job, we, America. Ever since I became a citizen, I kept saying we about bad things America does. That if we did a good job, right? If the bomb really broke the will of the Japanese to fight, right? So the first part is about this, about the idea of morale, psychological idea of morale. We can come back to it in Q&A if you want. But I want to focus, because of the nature of conversation today, I want to focus on the second and third, which is about the idea of objectivity, transcultural psychiatry, and the role of politics and memory politics in science. So, putting aside the idea of morale, right? Let's talk about trauma across culture. Now, I want to mention it, and I mention it also in the book. I use the word trauma, but we should be very careful with the words we use, right? Because this is not a word that anybody uses, right? Very, very few people use it, even though it did exist before the 1970s, 1980s, right? But even the categories that existed, like war neurosis, has been completely denied, and here completely denied by psychiatrists at the time. So if you go into the early psychiatry in Japan, you go to the wartime, you see that there's ideologically driven denial of psychological suffering. So for example, in 1937, Kamata Shirabe, who is the chief psychiatrist of the Japanese army, said that unlike the Western militaries during the First World War, there had been no neurotic illness called war neurosis, right? Neurotic illness, war neurosis, okay? No trauma in the Japanese military since the present war broke out. I'm proud as a member of the military of the emperor that the fact shows that people of the Japanese empire have especially high morale. So the idea is that we Japanese that pride ourselves on our fighting spirit, Yamato Damashi, like the spirit of Yamato, the spirit of Japan, unlike weak Westerners, we don't break, right? And if people do break, if you go into the files, right, to the files, I forgot the word, the victim, patient files, basically, patient charts, of course. What you see is how they diagnose. I diagnose a lot of time as people that have a compensation neurosis, like Hosho Shinkeisho. It means they're not suffering because of what happened during the war or in battle. They're suffering because they're obsessed about getting compensation. And when you look at other cases, like for example the German case, and this is all of Japanese medicine is heavily influenced from German medicine. You see that the Germans are using the exact same phrase, right? Also pathoneurotic, Rente neurotica. That there's both in Germany and Japan at the same time, there is a blaming of the victims, right? So the victims suffer, something's wrong with them, right? And it's not because of the war, but because of the victims themselves. And this is not just in Germany, it's not just in Japan, it's actually across the board. And in the book, I go away from Germany and Japan and look at the US, look at Israel, look at the Holocaust case, and want to see maybe in other survivor communities people are more sympathetic, but I could find only a few cases. A case in point is a rumor about the sheep of fools that was in Israel in the early 1950s about a sheep full of, the name itself is very telling, a sheep full of supposedly mental patients that was coming from the camps in Europe to Israel. And there's a lot of panic about this sheep because those people are seen as a burden on society, right? They're not seen as people we should care for and heal, but people who will be a burden on the fledgling state, people who are stigmatized, people that something's wrong with them, right? Now, not everybody was like this. Not everybody thought about people who had mental pain and mental issues as people who were stained or stigmatized, right? So some people, like for example, Leo Stroll, you can see here, He was a military psychiatrist in an American army, and he actually saw a lot of continuities between soldiers and survivors. He worked in DP camps, displaced person camps, and refugees. But he was very exceptional. Most doctors that work with Holocaust refugees in Israel actually thought that survivors should heal immediately in a healthy environment in Israel. And if they didn't heal, the problem is with them. And you can see it in patient files from the military, from Israeli military. It's just much easier to get military files, state archives and everything. But also, I was very interested in connection between military and civilian here. And you can see that, like the Japanese army, Zionist Israeli doctors really emphasize, also socialist doctors, really emphasize ideology as a way to immune people from trauma, the same way that Japanese soldiers are immune, right? So, in one patient file, for example, in Russia at the time of Nazi invasion, the percentage of neurological disease was much lower. There is no doubt the wonderful mental health of a Soviet soldier must be attributed to his intense love for his homeland, right? And you can keep reading it, you see this, again, same thing. The Hebrew soldier have the same kind of idea, right? Imbued with patriotic love. And this is why they don't have mental illness. Same thing when you compare it to the survivors, right? So the Hebrew soldiers, pulse with steady and brave spirit, but the whole different psychopathological issue are the cases among the newcomers. Newcomers read survivors, Holocaust survivors. Many manifest the shocks of the past in various ways of mental and spiritual disturbances, and they have adjustment difficulties, right? So the problem is with them, they can't adjust, right? It's not what they've been through, right? They're not free from their mental bruises, chabarot nafshiyot, and they can't withstand the shocks of war. So there's something wrong with them. They're not ideologically committed enough. They're not people who should heal. They're people who, again, stigmatize and not to be trusted. Now, this change, this attitude towards survivors change in the late 50s and 60s. It's because of politically driven psychiatry and psychology. People who struggle against the German state refusal to give reparation for mental health issues for survivors. One case, again, a German doctor around 56 say that, and this is a guy who've been in Auschwitz, right? There is a psychic maldevelopment, Mr. H. We see, however, no possibility of assuming a causal connection or possibility of such a connection between this maldevelopment and persecution undergone until 45. So the Germans are using this idea of objectivity and cause and effect, scientific cause and effect. So you can prove that what happened during the war actually led to the symptoms you have right now. What doctors like Paul Chodov and others say, they don't use the objectivity game. They use the survivor side, right? They see the survivors as martyrs, almost. The people who are bearing the pain of humanity, right? And they see the suffering, you see in this quote here, as a memorial to their dead, as an act of existential expiation for species, for us, right? So you can't, they elevate the survivors in a way to demand recognition of their pain. And you can see it across the board. You see it also in this quote from Elie Wiesel, and I'm sorry for time, I'm not going to read the whole thing because I just noticed the time, so I need to rush a bit, right? So in here, in a Wiesel quote, right, I need to stick to this mic, right? So you see how Wiesel treats survivors as a messianic figure. People will save the world from a new Auschwitz, right? You cannot doubt the pains of Christ, the pains of the Messiah, right? It's elevation of survivors. So this political elevation of survivor actually lead to recognition of mental hurt, lead to recognition of survivor in the Holocaust case. Now, you have a very, very similar, actually almost word-to-word use of Christian language in the Hiroshima case. Hibakusha, survivors, right? So you have Yukimune Hajime, Hidankyo Survivor Organization, talks about 370,000 Hibakusha that are become like Christ, They bore the sins of the people. The exact same language, right? But you don't have recognition in the Hiroshima case. How can the politics led to recognition in the Holocaust case broke through this objectivity barrier, right? Scientific barrier. But doesn't happen in the Japanese case. And in the next 13 minutes and a half that I'm left, that's what I'm going to focus on. So let's look at Hiroshima. So in the book, I focus on a number of doctors. The first one, a military doctor named Konuma Masuho, former military doctor. Actually, almost all those people that I'm talking about, men, almost all men. We have I'm going to talk about gender a bit in a second. They did research on veterans, right? And they're all very, very influenced by German research, right? And I'm not going to details again for the purpose of time. But you see that just like the German case, they're very, very unsatisfied with simply psychogenetic explanation. They don't want just psychology. They want something more. They want something biological. They want something objective. Again, remember the German doctor that doesn't see anything objective and scientific? They want something objective also, right? So they keep insisting on finding something, and they can't find it. There is, unlike the American and European and Israeli doctors, there's no organizational efforts, there's no follow-up psychiatric studies, because they can't find this magic bullet of a somatic explanation to psychiatric illness, right? However, Konuma is exceptional because he keeps trying. He keeps trying, and also one of the only people who look through A-bomb fatigue or Burubura Bio disease, which is kind of similar to you have a Gulf War syndrome. I don't know if, I guess most of you are too young to remember, but this idea of the syndrome, people are just tired and don't know why, they don't have any energy, they're repressed, and you keep looking for it, right? But he just refused to just go to the psychology, right? So I just give you one example just to see like the horrible language I had to read again and again. It's supposed or recognizable that there lies diencephalic, namely central regulation disturbances of autarkic nervous functioners as the after effect of the A-bomb casualties. But it is not yet concluded that the facts have direct relation to A-bomb casualties. You see, the exact same thing that you see there, like it's going around, I can't find the causation, right? The exact cause of the disorder is being not clarified. It's just going around and just can't find this objective source, right, that they want. Another person that I found, the psychologist Kugio Shitoshi, of course, remember him? We started it. He also looked for scientific method, for objectivity, right? He actually suspects the survivors because in their panic situation, right, their memory is fragmentary, right? Expressing fragmentary language and speech, and therefore he doesn't want to just report what they say. He wants to analyze and find commonalities and find some kind of objective patterns, right? You need to, what we need to say scientific method, searching commonalities, ensure analysis objective is possible. And of course he can't. Because objectivity just keeps failing him. It's the way he failed Konuma Sao, the way it failed the Germans wanted to fail, right? Let me just skip the Hidankyu part also. Sorry, stop. Okay. Another set of people who wanted to fail is the American doctors in Hiroshima, the ABCC American Bomb Casualty Commission. We had a whole apparatus of people in Hiroshima, mostly biological sciences, geneticists and others, that basically look at the Hiroshima survivors as a resource to learn as much as possible about nuclear medicine. Didn't give them any kind of treatment, just research them, right? And they're completely uninterested in trying, right? And when they're pushed to, they basically very interestingly use the same excuse that the Germans used, right? That whatever existed in 1945 could not very well now be isolated from many other important events of that era, right? So you can't really, again, symptoms, event, you can't really make the connection. And what I argue in the book, in order to find this connection, right, you need some kind of political incentive, you need some kind of like, you see some kind of faith in the victims. And this doesn't exist in ABCC. Now, one thing that I want to mention, and just let's look at the first quote here, is there's also the factor of race and a factor of gender, right? Factor of gender. I'm going to skip the Lifton bit again. Time. I don't want to steal time. Take time from other people, right? So when he talks about Shimizu Kyoshi, a doctor who was advocating for recognition of survivors, Gilbert Wiebe, one very high official in the ABCC, said that I'm willing to believe that Shimizu's erroneous inferences stem from justified hatred of the bomb that took his son and from sentimentality toward the survivors. But he's obviously unable to tolerate our objectivity and will make a career out of being sentimentalist about the survivors. So Japanese are suspect. Victims are suspect. They can't be objective. And there's a long, long, long history of white scientists suspecting of non-white scientists, of what is proper science. Proper science is done in America, in the UK, in Germany. It's not done in Africa or China or other places, right? And this is kind of, especially in Japan, when you have this very particular power relationship between the American who occupy the country and the Japanese who are defeated, and Japanese victim. Again, victims are suspect, right? Now, sorry, again. Another, again, skipping. The last 7 minutes or so, I want to talk about all of this coming together, the politics. And I want to start with, again, the gender aspect. So one big thing that really bothered me, that almost every single person I spoke to about so far or looked at so far until the end of the book, they're all men. And I'm a guy also, right? And we're kind of trained not to do this, right? Like, always look for the other half of humanity, right? And what I realized that is gendering, it's a very particular important part of this, is that research is done by men, but the care of survivors is done by women. And women are not taken seriously, right? Women complaints are not taken seriously. Women ideas are not taken seriously. Only men can do real science and be objective, right? So one thing that I noticed is that in the 70s and 80s, you start to have more and more women involved. Second wave feminism in Japan, the student movement and others. And I found the origin of this in a social worker movement. Most of them are social workers. Social workers actually start at various places, but one people that I looked at is the ABCC, and the only place where we have almost all women, you can see this picture, almost all, and all Japanese, is the medical sociology and social workers. So the ABCC, for reasons I'm not going to get into, supply social workers to the hibakusha. Now, those social workers, because they operate in the American environment, actually are not, and I argue in the book, actually because they're women, because they're Japanese, they have to be more objective than their supervisors. They can't be suspect, right? So actually there is kind of the operation of gender here and the operation of power actually work against recognition. So you can see, for example, I highlighted in the patient files how they treat patients, right? And they talk about giving them support, but eventually it's the fault of the hibakusha. They took an inferiority complex, right? They have to reflect on the problem, which is unscientific, right? It's basically pull yourself out of by your own bootstraps, right? It's your fault. Just get over it, right? It's kind of tough love, right? It's Kodamaki, a social worker, right? And this attitude only started to change after the 60s in the 60s, when you have a new movement of social workers, right? And a new generation of sociologists, one of them Ishida Tadashi, that started to think to connect social work, care, and politics. And in here, the impact of Lifton and impact of the Holocaust is important, right? You see not just comparison here, but actual entanglement, right? People were reading each other. People were aware of each other, right? So Ishida Tadashi read Lifton, and he said in an interview, right, so it was a shock to me that an American could conduct such a study before as Japanese, a study about hibakusha, but this is because they had the experience of Auschwitz, right? And what did the experience of Auschwitz taught Lifton, what taught Ishida? This is actually, is a sort of methodology of how to treat pain, right? How to connect pain to psychological work and political work. And so how to utilize pain, right? So what Ishida is talking about, that Lifton is doing, experience what he's doing, is actually going to the work of Frankl, Viktor Frankl, and he take from Frankl a quote from Spinoza. He said, "A suffering ceases to be suffering as soon as we form a clear and precise picture of it." What he said, and this is from a speech he gave to social workers in '76, he says that method is extremely objective way to get a sense of your own struggles, right? This is something that all of you, talking to social worker, right, will experience in your case studies. If the subject is convinced that you are saying is true, he or she will be able to gain a certain spiritual ground. Again, this Christian language kind of creeping in, right? And also you see from the image there of the book, right? Which will give him or her a certain insight into how to live, act, and think in the future. The subject itself has been able to contribute to the spiritual work of trying to convert his various experiences into ideas, so pain into ideas. By going through such ideological work, the subject can be prevented from being carried away by the suffering and able to confront the affliction and establish himself or herself as a subject who can overcome it. So the idea is very different, similar to the idea that reformulation at Lifton have. I'm not going to get into it, but basically through struggle, political struggle, and giving testimony about the Baum, the Hibaksha will overcome their suffering, they will cease to suffer, they will overcome what we now call trauma, and become free of pain. So here, if in the Holocaust case, politics have led to recognition and eventually treatment, here politics is the treatment. And in a way, and ironically, against all the wishes of the social workers, it leaves the people who are suffering from psychiatric issues suspect because they haven't overcome. They are not the political strugglers that the others are, right? And you can see it very clearly, and this I'm going to finish. I'm going to use the last 1 minute and 32 seconds I have to talk about a very small and very telling case that happened in 2010-11 in Nagasaki, where psychiatrists inserted psychological suffering as a category for compensation. They call them the people who suffer psychologically, not hibaksha, not people who experience the Baum, not can't really translate it, people who were exposed to the Baum, but hibaku taikensha, people who were exposed to the experience of the Baum. Right, Yuki? Kind of, right? So they had the experience category, but actually there is a movement of survivors against the category. And they say, we don't want to have PTSD alone. We are, quote unquote, real survivors, real hibaksha. We also suffer from radiation damage. They fail to see this as a legitimate category, standalone legitimate category. They don't say there's no such thing as PTSD, right? But just say this is not enough. And this is unthinkable in the Western context. But this is because of this long history that I was talking about, where PTSD and trauma and pain were denied. Again, not always denied as a form of political oppression, but denied as unable to see, and also in a particular way that politics was employed in Japan to both by the people who were trying to, still 15 seconds. Both of the people, like the American doctors and Japanese doctors, who were hampered by all those things that I'm talking about, but also, ironically, against all the wishes of the social workers and people who wanted to care, against the best intention also by the people who tried to help the survivors. And I'm going to end here. Thank you.
I'm going to introduce the panelists now. Would you like to sit there, or probably you want to stay here, right, to see the...
Yeah, maybe we'll move there in the Q&A.
Yeah, okay. So, I thought you had one person.
I thought she was going first.
Okay.
No, but I don't
I can go ahead.
So I'll ask the people who have slides. I can go first.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'll introduce you. Okay, thank you, Ran. And let me introduce the panelists. The first panelist, as you heard that we are talking about who goes first. So the first panelist here. Okay, Dr. Ola Glantman. She is the director of the combined BA, MS, and MS in community psychology programs, as well as the coordinator of the undergraduate community psychology concentration and the undergraduate and graduate trauma certificate. Her research interests include cultural diversity, improving academic settings, technology and AI use in higher education, and migration and diaspora. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I don't have any slides and I'm going to be really quick. I'm not going to take up all 10 minutes. I would much rather go back to Q&A. But the reason that I got really excited when I heard about this book is because I saw many of the overlapping connections between my own lived experience as well as the type of training that I received, the type of work that I do, and my research. So going back to this idea of positionality, right? So having grown up in the former Soviet Union, especially on the territory of Ukraine, I firsthand experienced the denial after the Chernobyl explosion and how the government used this tragedy very similarly culturally to downplay the effects so that we did not see us as weak. And so it was really interesting to see that in the book as well. And I'm also experiencing this blackmail of potential nuclear disasters and attack right now as I'm watching Russia kind of, blackmailing everybody, but especially Ukraine, and how much trauma is being experienced by the war-torn country, but also living under this constant threat of potential nuclear attack. I'm also really excited talking about Ukraine. I'm really excited in moving right now into potential collaboration with one of our partners, UKU, Ukrainian Catholic University, specifically working with their clinical faculty with a focus on trauma and resilience of those returning from fighting, but also just general folks. So we're starting to talk about the resilience of students and youth in general who live every day in a war-torn country. I'm also trained as a community psychologist, which again, I saw that in the book a lot, this idea we were talking earlier about what is kind of communal trauma and communal healing, and how do you balance that with individual healing? How do you move on from acts like war and disasters and the effect of that on individuals? So among other things, I really was interested in seeing some of the clinical aspects of it, but also reflecting my own training, working in communities, and the dedication that we have as a field to specifically those most vulnerable, those who have experienced at least one form and sometimes many forms of trauma. So I was really, excited to be able to read the book, and then we had a fantastic conversation earlier. I'm going to stop here because I want to give more time to the Q&A, because I do want to talk more and see kind of some of your perspectives on some of those things. But thank you so much for being here today and for having me on the panel.
Thank you. The next panelist, Maureen Seal. She is an associate professor in the Department of Geography. She trained as a hydrologist and has worked in China, Thailand, Cambodia, Malaysia, Singapore, and with First Nations communities in Canada. Concerned with the subjective process of how communities made decisions when confronting environmental issues, her research evolved to post-colonialism and then to economics and psychoanalysis. She is the author of Colonial Trauma and the Post-Colonial Anxieties, The Haunted Choices of Economic Development, Routledge 2024, and co-author of Global Libidinal Economy with Ilan Kapoor, Gavin Friedel, and Pieter de Vries, State University of New York 2023. Thank you, Maureen.
Someone has removed my slideshow. Let's see. Can I get some tech help here?
Not on the desktop?
It has been removed. Okay, all right. So I just want to add my thanks to everyone else, to Rand for disrupting a narrative that has been long accepted. And if...
Stay as close to the microphone as you can.
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
So I just wanted to add my thanks to Rand for disrupting a narrative that has gone on far too long unchallenged. When I first heard he was coming here, your name reminded me of the term chaos in a good way.
Feel free to use a handheld.
Can people not hear me at the back?
I felt very...
For the recording purpose.
Oh, I see. Okay. All right. So, I'm not even going to attempt pronouncing this. My Japanese student tried to coach me this morning, but I don't think I can remember. Anyway, what really struck me about the book when I was reading it is that the term means wounds of the heart. So I thought that I would focus just very much on this idea of the wounds of the heart. Okay. So I was very impressed that you asked this very simple question, but then I think it's something that is close to my heart because the wounds of the heart again, because I think it's very much about the role of denial and silence and this underground history that usually accompanies any kind of denial and silence. I work mostly with colonialism, so this issue of silence about colonial after effects is actually very powerful. Right? If you are using a Foucauldian genealogy to study trauma, I wanted to frame it put it in conversation with my work, and I wanted to start first of all with Judith Butler's Frames of War. Now, her book looks at this idea of when is life grievable, but whenever you start to talk about when is life grievable, you're really talking about whose life is grievable, right? And if you're talking about whose life is grievable, then who gets to decide that that life is grievable or not? How do you qualify to have a life that is grievable? Butler's thesis argues that we shouldn't talk about precariousness for these people who and their suffering, because precariousness is a condition of life. All of us are subject to precariousness because we will die, right? But it is, in fact, precarity. The minute you start talking about precarity as opposed to precariousness, then we enter into the realm of morality and moral choice. Who gets to decide whose life is grievable, right? There is that element of injustice that some people's lives will be grievable at certain times, of course, because it is contingent, and that grievability could change at another point in time when those same lives are no longer considered to be grievable. But again, who gets to decide when those conditions change, that that life is no longer grievable? So what I wanted to do is, putting this in conversation with my own work, is to go back to Judith Herman's very powerful point, I think, that whenever you talk about denial and silence, there is always an underground history, right? So instead of talking the prehistory, I'm just going to focus on this underground history. So for me, I don't even want to call it hypothesis because it's like I've got like 7 minutes, right? nuclear mines are born in the wounds of the heart. So Iran is talking about the context of how these disciplines influence the American and Japanese scientists and the timing of when they, come up with their views. I wanted to talk about the how the relational identities of these different actors influence the understanding of whose suffering counts or not, right? And I use Heinz Kohut's self-object model because I think it's very relevant to this notion of the wounds of the heart. A lot of his model is really about wounding, right? So the self-object model, very quickly, is that the self, the identity that you have, is very much dependent on the self-object. The self-object can be another group, or it can be, I think Kohut actually even at one point talks about music as the self-object. But crucially, your self-image, your ability to have a coherent sense of who you are, is very much dependent on the approving mirror that the self-object holds up to you. Now, I think one of the things that this Rand's book brings up, of course, is that the geopolitics of World War II is especially important, right? Because if you think about it, when we talk about Vietnam has a very muddy history for Americans. It is not the kind of war where there's a clear victor, right? World War II, which is why we keep making movies about it, is considered the last moral military victory. In the same light, where I worked and where I wrote my book about is about the counterinsurgency in Malaya. Think about this, okay? 650,000 people got incarcerated in concentration camps. Yet, this is considered the last moral counterinsurgency. There is no muddiness about whether the victors were, deserving or not. It is understood that the victors were deserving, despite having incarcerated 650,000 people. That's completely forgotten. Why? And it's not forgotten just by the British, where it's convenient for them to forget. It is forgotten in Malaya as well, or Malaysia today. Why? So I wanted to talk about this notion of shame in the underground history. Right. How much time do I have left? Okay, so if you talk about shame in the underground history, it's understandable why, with the Americans, we don't want to remember about the fact that there are all these people who are suffering as a result of our moral victory. This is a very disapproving mirror to hold up to anyone, right? On the other hand, what really intrigued me more when I was reading Rand's book is, well, on the part of the people who are more suffering, why do you want to forget? That to me, or why do you want to deny your suffering? And that to me is key to why this grievable life or non-grievable life is actually not just perpetuated by those who imposed or created the suffering, but also those who are suffering, right? This whole notion of the shame that accompanies victims, to me that is so powerful. Why is it that in colonized countries, it is not just the colonizers or formerly colonized countries, it is not just the colonizers who try to forget. It is also those who have been colonized, right? It is similar to rape victims. Why is it that shame is attached to those who have been raped? But it is, and this is such a powerful notion. If shame is something that accompanies the victims, that we have managed to persuade victims that they should be ashamed of their victimization because they are powerless to resist humiliation and the suffering that is imposed on them, then how do we ever bring this to light? This continues. It is a wound on both parts. For the Americans, it is a wound that is something that they need to deny, because otherwise this wounding to the self, the grandiose self of the moral victor, is tarnished. On the part of the victims, it is an admission that they are weak, that they have not been able to resist. And I think this is what Bran was talking about, the earlier notion of the earlier idea of Holocaust victims trying to deny it, right? So if that's the case, I just want to very quickly end with a question that I thought was useful for all of us, which is to think about this. If denial and silence are so closely tied to a libidinal identification, in other words, it is tied to our self-love, right? A perpetuation of an identity that we feel that we need to defend, because without that identity, we are shamed, we are weak. Then how do we ever break the silence, right? How do we address suffering if even those who are suffering have been made to feel that that suffering is a badge of shame, it is a badge of their less than human identity? Okay, anyway, that's it.
Sorry. Okay, our last panelist, Linda Tuck. She's a fourth-year clinical community psychology PhD student at DePaul University. She's a second-generation Khmer American. Linda is interested in the ways historical trauma and the structural violence impact mental health among Southeast Asian American families. She is passionate about community-based approaches to research and clinical interventions, especially regarding refugee and migrant communities. Thank you, Linda.
Oh, should I use? Is this? It might be easier. I'm quite sure.
I'm going to give you a different. We just have to. These batteries go down quickly.
Oh, okay.
Do you want to
Do you want me to just? I can just use the.
Okay. I got it.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Okay, perfect. I will also try to shorten up because I just think there's so many interesting perspectives here. And I would love to get to the Q&A. So thank you for the introduction, Yuki. I wanted to introduce my construct of interest in general, which is historical trauma. And when I was reading Ron's book, I think what really struck me, and what us in psychological sciences may not always be able to do to the fullest extent, is focus on our positionality and our reflexivity as researchers, right? And so with my own interest, being among my own community as Cambodian Americans who have experienced a legacy of genocide, and with myself being a second-generation direct descendant of refugees, this is something that we're not always able to do at the critical eye, right? And so I am very excited to discuss the positionality, the racialization that occurs within the sciences, and maybe the blind spots to what we perceive as objectivity. Right, and secondly, what I appreciate about historical trauma is this construct being that a cataclysmic event, an event of mass atrocity, can be so significant that it affects a community's psyche. And to me, as an incoming grad student, this is such a stark difference from what we are taught and how we conceptualize post-traumatic stress, right? So when we think of post-traumatic stress and post-traumatic stress disorder, we see it under the lens of an individualized pathology. We see it as something the individual experiences in response to a traumatic event. And so we owe the legacy of a lot of American Indian, Alaskan Native scholars who have constructed the idea that historical trauma can be so significant, it impacts an entire community's psyche. And so what does that mean for us as a community, right? So I was really interested in, and this piqued my curiosity as a Khmer American, given that we had underlying similarities of experiencing systemic and mass violence. So with what we know with PTSD, we experience this mental health disorder as something that is an individualized acute event, right? The person experiences this acute event. It's a single traumatic event, and thus a mental health disorder is formed, right? And so research about PTSD among Cambodian Americans in particular focuses on Cambodian refugees. And for good reason. One study found that 61% of a sample, a very substantial sample of Cambodian refugees, met threshold for PTSD symptoms. And so it's been a hallmark understanding when you think of the Cambodian American community among scholarship, you think of mental health automatically. It's almost this instinctive association, right? And what I wanted to call attention towards is the caution of creating a flattening of an event. And so it's not inaccurate in the assessment that this genocidal trauma had a significant impact on the community, right? There's no denying that. But inadvertently, scholarship can risk conceptualizing the genocide as a singular adverse event, when in reality, the genocide exposed several people to several forms of different traumas over several time periods. So let me pull up a table that I had been working on with my dear friend, Erica May. It's meant to be visually overwhelming. I don't know if it's legible, but in reality, when we conceptualize genocide, the person is experiencing a series of acute and chronic traumas. They're experiencing it over a series of time periods, right? Over a series of geographic locations. And under historical trauma, this idea is that trauma can be so significant that it passes on to subsequent generations, even to those who haven't experienced that traumatic event themselves, right? So rather than considering genocide as a singular event, we can understand genocide survivors to have experienced things like exposure to death, torture, execution, coercion to perform abuse, forced inhumane labor. I don't have to necessarily read this, but experiencing traumatic events from their time in Cambodia during the genocide, from their time in the refugee camps when they move on, right, to experiencing resettlement in the United States. All of these different events are forming and capturing the Cambodian American experience. Now, Erica May is a PhD student at UCI. Her discipline is public health. And with both of us being in social sciences, we felt like our disciplines at its current state couldn't conceptualize this, couldn't move past the genocide as beyond this one adverse event. And so we turned to interdisciplinary literature to construct this, right? And it was really scholarship from historical scholars, from legal scholars, and from anthropological scholars who have documented this systematic series of acute traumas and chronic traumas that Cambodian Americans have experienced. And lastly, when I look at my own research among second-generation Cambodian Americans, looking at how they themselves conceptualize historical trauma, I'll be the first to admit that my research project, my research question is from a deficit-based lens, right? I'm asking them, hey, what are you thinking about trauma? But what was really interesting to me and what was really important and fascinating to me is that second-generation Cambodian Americans were keen and excited to discuss historical trauma in the context of healing. And so when they talked about healing, what was consistently brought up time and time again was that there was a need for a collectivist notion of healing. There was a constant discussion about how to forgive parents, right? How to teach parents mental health skills. A lot of things that get lost in the literature when we pathologize and focus on pathologies of the community. Right, so in the literature right now, a lot of the discussion about intergenerational trauma is about parental abuse, parental dysfunction, relational dysfunction, and it's not quite the full picture, right? When we talk about second-generation Cambodian Americans and their needs and their experiences, it's significantly more complex than what quantitative studies are able to capture without fully understanding the community perspective. So I wanted to end with the understanding and the notion that Cambodian Americans are a persistently invisibilized group, right? We're subsumed under a larger Asian American category. But then in scholarship, we are hyper-visibilized in ways related to genocidal trauma. And so I wanted to bring in a participant quote. He said it much more succinctly than I could. And I wanted to call in, Ran, in your conclusion in the book, right? Atomic bomb survivors who felt exploited, prodded by researchers who did not receive treatment, right? Face that same flattening, right, of the event itself. But this participant quote reads, "I think that we struggle with letting everything be at the same time. Genocide always takes precedence in almost every conversation that we have, whether it be textbooks, whether it be art or theater. And it's like everyone wants to talk about the genocide, and I know that it's a big part, but at the same time, it's a tiny blip. Thank you.
Thank you. So now I would like to invite the panelists at the table. And thank you very much for all the panelists that your talks are fascinating. I was thinking of, actually Maureen was nicely set up the question there, and Ola was talking about this unwillingness to admit vulnerability, which can play out both in authorities and the victims themselves. And Maureen was talking about that precarity, which is a politically induced condition, so that people are, so as opposed to precariousness, which people share in general. And I think given that, what Ran was also posing here is, the first thing is, unrecognized symptom was as a result of not denial, but the absence of framework. So I thought that was an interesting concept. And also, secondly, as we talked about precarity and precariousness, or unwillingness to admit vulnerability, and Rand's last example was Hibakusha sufferers of the atomic bombing, and also sufferers who are not admitted as or recognized as the sufferer by the government. So it seems like there are two different players, authorities and victims who are able to recognize their own harms, but then authority is not. So it seems like denial, both parties could deny themselves or deny the harm, but the last case that Ran was raising is that authorities' reluctance. So the different players here. So I thought that it was interesting. And then another thing is intergenerational trauma that Linda was posing. And I can see that all those keywords kind of put the panelists together. So I'm excited to hear if you have questions from the floor. I would like to take it.
I guess I was just thinking about how the points that are being made about how that trauma can be worn as like people can respond to trauma and act as though it's like something they have to be stoic about, and then it almost gives them like a badge of honor if they're stoic about it. And I was thinking about how people view like some of the victims of World War II or the soldiers that may have been traumatized kind of with this lens of like having almost like a fetish for the stoicism, or like a fetish for the way in which these victims that there was something special about the victims of World War II because they were the last generation to sort of be stoic about their trauma. I think people think about the British in this way as well. So I don't know, it's just kind of rambling thoughts, but I don't know.
It's not. It's a different understanding of suffering than we have in our generation in America, right? So I'll be very interested in the intergenerational trauma, like the community trauma, because it's different culture and different understanding of suffering. So I was kind of surprised that you used the word trauma so much, because I don't know if people who were in Cambodia understand this using the same terms. So we have a particular understanding of trauma. So when I write a syllabus, and this is all of us here on the table, and I have to be very, very careful with all the language I use in terms of trigger warning, right? And not to expose my students to particular kinds of violence, sexual and others. When I teach about historical violence, it's very, very hard, but this is something that happened here. If you teach in other countries, they don't care at all. It's not a problem, because it's different cultures, have different sensitivities, different understanding. And also, different times in history. So, I mean, there's a very famous saying, in history, the past is a foreign country. So the people of the generation, and again, I'll be very careful because different countries, different places, have a different understanding of suffering. And suffering, Steve Upper Lip, the British one, right? Something that you should carry. Maybe not a burden, but something that, so in case of my grandparents were Holocaust survivors, they didn't think they're survivors or even something of pride. Everybody suffered. That's it. There's no meaning to it. There's a very famous quote by Ruth Bontier, a Holocaust survivor. Not famous, but something that I was used to teaching. There's nothing to be gained, there's nothing to be learned. They died and that's it. Like talking about, this is not something we can accept as a society. We always think there is a meaning right now. There's a meaning to this, especially to this big story of the Holocaust and the bomb. And World War II, the last good war. We insist on meaning, but different generation, different people, different communities think about it differently. So I think we have to be very careful in like taking our categories and our understanding and impose it back and to other cultures. So yeah, people I spoke with, yeah, they had this understanding, but now it's very different. You want to take it from?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, well, my research specifically focuses on second generation Cambodian Americans, right? And so there's always that confluence where Cambodian Americans will have that American influence. There's an American understanding of trauma,
Yeah.
right? So when you discuss second generation Khmer Americans who are trying to make meaning and make understanding of not only their suffering, but their parents' suffering or their grandparents' suffering,
Yeah.
right? There is that underlying understanding that trauma is the definition that they can turn to, right? And I think to a lot of people, having that definition can be very helpful and very useful. But that's not to say that trauma isn't understood in different regions, right? So in Cambodia, there is a cultural syndrome. It's called Baik Spat, and it literally translates into broken skin, right? And so when you read the syndromes, when you read what the Cambodian psychologist is assessing, it's trauma within within cultural norms.
I would just add, can people hear me? Okay, so I would just add that with, in the case of at least the colonized countries that I'm familiar with, like Malaysia and Singapore, there is, especially in the case of Singapore actually, there is a real denial that colonialism had any negative impacts on the country because they want to see themselves as part of the modern successful world. And to have once been victimized in any way is really something that's very, very shameful. So even the kind of suffering that they experience under colonialism, both in Malaysia and with Singapore, has been narrativized as almost like a stage in modernization that they had to go through, and in the process that this kind of suffering will make them better and more successful people.
Maureen, what's the impact on individuals?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So the community narrativizes suffering
Yeah.
as something that led to overcoming and led to success, right?
Yeah.
Which is a very familiar story for me. How does it impact individuals? Do individuals carry still the wounds, or they just don't display symptoms? I mean, there's a play between the cultural stuff and the medical stuff here.
Well, when you say, do they display symptoms, I think for me, the most obvious symptom is the kind of anxiety around economic success, right? That economic success becomes like the antidote to past shame. And for families, if you are not successful, the individual members who are not successful almost become like erased from, the family law.
Yeah,
because
I'm talking about in particular individuals, right, that went through, like people who has...
Okay, you're talking about the people who were in the concentration camps.
Well, people who went through those experiences, right, but they're completely it's not something you talk about. It's not something
No,
that you mentioned. So
you can't talk
do
about
they
it.
so play? Is there hidden symptoms? Is there any medical effect?
You mean there's manifestation?
Yeah, as a
How does it
manifestation. Given
manifest?
that there's no acknowledgement whatsoever, because I'm very interested, and I guess that's what the question about, like between community, cultural narrativization, right? It's
Yeah.
what you were talking about, right? And something that Isa talked about, like the clinical manifestation. And I think there's a very interesting play here.
I
And
think
so
it's-
a question is in Singapore, Malaya, do you have clinical symptoms, not cultural?
I'm not a psychologist, so I don't want to talk about whether I can recognize the clinical
Yeah.
symptoms or not.
Sorry, maybe I'm pushing you a different
I think-
direction. Yeah.
I think the fact that these are highly anxious societies
Yeah.
with their, I mean, a lot of East Asian societies are societies with high rates of suicide. I don't know if that's recognizable as a clinical symptom, but
Suicide? No, let's ask the clinicals here. I'm not a clinical also, but because as a historian of science, I need to at least, yeah, go ahead. Let's ask the clinical people. Yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to push you.
No,
this thing.
that's okay.
I think I'm curious. I'm wondering if you could repeat your question. I know it was in relation to colonial mentality, right? But is
So
it
my question is, okay, so there's differentiation, and there's something that I talk about in the book also, and I really care about it. There is a confusion between trauma as a cultural explanation mechanism to how communities deal with past wrongs that has been spiraling out of medical world into society, where we as societies think that societies operate like individuals, right? Societies, like an individual, can go through medical-like trauma, and then the way that they handle it also, and the way that they deal with this, suppression and returning memories and all this stuff, it's kind of translated into the social realm. Now, as a historian who deals with science, I'm uncomfortable with this because societies function different than individuals. But there's a very complex relationship, as you showed and you talked a little bit in your work, and I'm sure in yours also, between the culture and the clinical bit, right? How does this connect? So that's what I'm trying to understand. How does this cultural story, the story societies tell themselves, how does it relate back to the clinical story?
Yeah.
Because it's two different things, right?
Yeah, and I think I can speak to this in the context of my
Yeah.
research with second-generation Khmer Americans, right? Because what we're finding is that with what I keep calling the flattening of this genocidal experience, right? It's almost like this narrative of the genocide has consumed what people understand as the Cambodian American experience. And so when the individual is trying to understand their own culture, right, because there is that cultural gap with themselves being American, but also contending with the fact that they have Khmer heritage, or trying to understand their Khmer culture, what a lot of participants have discussed is that there's very little outside of understanding their culture beyond a genocidal context, right? So when you look up literature about Cambodia, when you look up literature about history, when you look at the documentaries, the books, the narrative is about the genocide. And so when it comes to understanding their own culture, it deeply, deeply affects them, right? And whether or not we can delineate that within a psychological world, I think is going to be very challenging, right? We're limited, and I'm looking at you as the other community psychologist, but we're limited by our scientific methodology, by the way we're researching, by our need to empiricize these things, right? So that continuous narrative of the Cambodian American experience is related to the genocide. It does have that profound impact where it is almost overshadowing a proper whole identity in a way that I think other survivors have experienced, right? In your presentation, when you discuss Holocaust survivors, this need to put like religious figures, right? Like the coming of Christ, to understand that there's purpose behind this suffering. Right? I think Cambodian Americans, we're Buddhists, we don't.
There's no purpose.
So it's a bit harder in that sense, but there is still a need to make meaning, right? And what Cambodian Americans are coming toward is, this is important. This genocide has had significant impact on my life, on my parents' life, but why is it the whole picture? Like, why is this the only narrative that seems to be of importance, particularly in the academic world?
I don't have any quantitative figures to give, but if you're saying how does it manifest itself in the way individuals understand what happened in colonialism, is it comes out in the fact that the narrative of race dominates, at least in Malaysia and to a certain extent still in Singapore, even though they deny this, that the narrative of race dominates how they understand interpersonal relationships in like every avenue. It is incredible. It is, I mean, if you think about that, they won independence in 1957, that they are still talking about how race influences every election. How people vote is through the narrative of race. And it all, I mean, economic policies are understood through this narrative of race. And it's everything, like where you go to school, how you, what kind of education you get, the link between education and where you will end up professionally. Over here, we talk about in terms of class. Over there, class is still significant, but it is race which is the like container in which people understand it. I don't have quantitative figures, so that probably doesn't count as clinical work, but it's the qualitative explanation, I guess.
So I don't think this is the answer per se to your question, but I do wonder how culture plays into even the question when you kept saying, for example, the trauma experienced by the soldiers. I'm like, but they didn't see this trauma.
Yeah.
It was their, you can say suffering, because who gets to almost like operationally define suffering? Because PTSD is very medically created, and you know, and even then things change. I mean, we update like
it's also
DSM.
created for perpetrators, by the way.
Right. So we had the conversation earlier. Is that when I share that my grandmother, for the 3 years that she was under the occupation of the Germans, having been married to a Jewish man and raising a Jewish child, she kept waiting that every day somebody's going to knock on the door and say your neighbor sold you out. And it didn't happen. They survived. But can you imagine the stress? But she didn't even think that this is trauma or somebody, I need to see a clinician about it. So to me, thinking about trauma from the perspective that we're thinking about it, it is very much westernized and it is very much medical because that just didn't exist before. So when you were asking a question, I was thinking, interesting. So what would they call themselves? What was it that there wasn't even a question? They would not even complain about it because there was no such notion. And if in your culture there is no focus on clinical work, so like me, you know, as refugees, I do remember myself talking to my parents about possibly going to see a clinician, and my mom saying, "Oh no, don't do it. It's going to go on your permanent record, whatever that is." But her having grown up in Soviet Union where there was no mental health, that's another layer of how do you address trauma when you are disconnected. There is no mental health attached to, or there is no need, or it's just so complicated. And so I loved how you said earlier during our conversation before the meeting that, you know, we are trying to understand history using the framework that we are using right now in our lived experiences versus what people have actually experienced at the time.
But there's a difference, right, in like recognizing that there was this mass suffering and that it has consequences in politics today versus saying that, well, the framing has changed over time. And I think that in the case of, you know, I'm just thinking of the people who lived through the concentration camps. Some of them are still like alive. You know, they were herded into these camps. They were experiencing shelling, bombing, and they can't move anywhere because they're basically, you know, contained within these barbed wire camps, right? And at the end of it, because the other side won, they're not even allowed to talk about it, but it has to come out in some way. And we don't have to talk about it as trauma, but we can acknowledge that there was suffering, which today we call trauma, and that it has consequences.
I think that's what we were alluding to, the manifestation of it. So
Yeah.
even if you don't call it
So-
trauma, how does it come out?
Yeah.
Is it
And that's
alcoholism?
and-
Is it domestic violence?
Well, it's
Or is it
definitely
depression?
war and
or
violence.
suicide, right?
Well, I like the fact that Linda was talking about domestic violence because, and in the second generation trauma is, war doesn't end when the bombs stop falling,
Yep.
right?
Yeah.
War doesn't end. Violence tends to continue, and a lot of time at the home.
Yep.
So domestic violence is a big
Yeah.
manifestation of this. Soldiers come back from war.
We see that in Russia, happening in Russia
Yeah, they're
right
not treated,
now.
alcoholism,
Yeah.
all this stuff. When the state doesn't take responsibility and there's no admission of suffering and no any kind of mechanism in place, violence remains in the society. Societies are brutalized, and you can definitely, for example, explain the rise of, post-World War I brutalization of politics and fascism and all this stuff, definitely through the experience of World War I. Whether we should use clinical terms to use it, that's another question, because it
Yeah.
leads to what Linda was talking about, flattening of experience.
Yeah.
That we have one-size-fits-all category that was developed in the US, a very particular connection of the 1970s, 1980s,
Cookie cutter.
and we just put it in different societies. And the question is, maybe it eventually does us more harm than good.
But I don't use the clinical.
I'm not saying
No, no.
it's not criticism of you, Marie. Not criticism of you. I'm actually was more referring to what Linda was talking about, flattening of experience, right?
Yeah.
And yeah,
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I didn't-
yeah. Go ahead. Yeah.
No, I do feel a push and pull
Yeah.
since I practice in clinical community psychology. As Alma knows best, I think this is paradoxical, right?
Yeah.
And as someone within the clinical realm and a student clinician, right, I do want to make clear that there is strong work, strong evidence about the pathologization through PTSD lens, right? It's been helpful, clinical treatments are helpful, but also like when considering the experiences of survivors, of subsequent generations of the survivors, when you look at PTSD, how it's treated is it's seen more often as a cognitive deficit, right? So you're treating people based on trying to correct their negative beliefs, their negative thoughts, their negative behaviors. And through this lens, for survivors who have experienced much, and the trauma doesn't stop, as we said, after that initial event, right? It's ongoing, it creates more trauma, however we want to define it. It has that push and pull. For survivors in that state of shock, how useful is it to course correct these negative behaviors, thoughts, and challenges? How successful is it, right? And I think that's where clinical psychology can fall flat as an evidence to my own own field of study, right?
You can create suffering through providing. I mean, there is evidence that pharmaceutical companies in Japan, so Jiku Kitagawa, like a anthropologist in Keio in Japan, she did research about
Depression?
Depression, yeah, sorry. About depression. Now, there's a whole history of depression. I mean, is it clinical or not? I mean, is being sad being sick? When is being sick becoming sick? It's very culturally defined, right? But there is research that shows how pharmaceutical companies actually sell the idea of depression, and people actually start using pills. It just happened, right? So we really have to think about how good those things do if we supply those categories in societies which are not American or Western and have very different. And this is why I was asking you about manifestation, because Southeast Asia is not the U.S., right?
And they don't use any of those categories.
Yeah.
But the fact that...
And this is why I'm interested in what they do use. What do they use?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think there is an acknowledgement, whether people will verbally say it or not,
Yeah.
that there was suffering.
Yeah,
Because
of course.
that's kind of like easy to think, right? They got bombed and shelled while being stuck inside like these barbed wire camps.
Yeah.
And 650,000 of them, that's a lot. But they don't talk about it as trauma. They don't talk about it in clinical terms. They don't take pills for it. It just manifests itself in this highly, highly anxious, angry society.
Yeah.
One of my friends describes Singapore as the Death Wish Society.
Doesn't sound like a very fun place.
It is not, really. I mean, the joke about University of Chicago is where fun goes to die. You could also apply it to some countries. So there's a reason. But I think it's a manifestation of why they are so, it comes out in their anxiety. And the anxiety is manifested especially in the economic arena. It is seen as economic success becomes like what Frantz Fanon said was a form of lactification. Or we can think of it as like the antidote to what they cannot talk
But like
about.
a Band-Aid solution, because you don't really get to the root cause.
Yeah.
You just, this is kind of how you
Well, it always
replace
stays
one.
underground.
Yeah, that's terrible.
Is there more questions from the audience? I mean, we can keep talking for like 3
Sorry.
hours, I think. But yeah, go ahead.
I had kind of I developed a second question when I was thinking about you guys talking. But the first is like, so you talked about categorization of trauma, like as, that it's a difference in thinking about things that happened, especially after World War II, that the idea of trauma kind of emerged and then also like affected how people then experience those things. Like once they fall into the empirical guidelines of trauma, then they're thinking about their experiences as like, this is trauma, and then how does that change people's experience of, especially like in the sense of like second generation Cambodians as well, like, seeing it as trauma, how does that change the experience of like thinking about yourself and your more clinical symptoms, and but also like thinking about that experience. And so that was like part of it. And then I was also thinking like that it's an interesting situation with PTSD that it is one of the only like mental disorders, I guess, that is specifically tied to an event rather than like a kind of pathologization of like health. And so like how does that situate itself differently in how we think about that, like in terms of treatment, but also like communally and like, yeah, that's a good question.
I guess the clinical side of the table should take it, yeah.
I feel like I've been hugging the mic. I apologize.
Rightfully so.
But so what I'm hearing is that there's something different about PTSD, right? It's the idea that it comes from that acute singular event. And the conceptualization of PTSD was created in response, as we know, to World War II, right? So it was very much under the consideration of the veteran and what the veteran experienced. And when the veteran was reporting, like for instance, the hallmark of PTSD being the intrusive flashback, the intrusive memory, visual imagery, right? It kind of makes sense historically, like you can trace it back to that one event. For marginalized populations or populations that experience chronic traumatic events such as colonialism, right? How do we picture that? How does that fit in the context? Even when you think about people who experience complex traumatic stress, when you experience physical abuse from a parent, for instance, time and time again, how do you visualize that? It doesn't necessarily fit into the criterion that list, right, that the DSM requires for PTSD. So I'm hoping I'm answering your question, but there are those limitations from how PTSD was constructed, in my belief, in my sense, right? PTSD is very narrow, right? Even trauma as our big word, even as we're kind of poking at what trauma is and if it even exists or can be transferred across countries and cultures, even trauma within our American context, it's kind of like, how is it and how are we limited by that one DSM diagnosis?
Yeah.
I was just going to add that culturally, at least where I work, the interesting thing is the way they talk about financial crises. The fact that it's recurrent, the way they describe it is like this nightmare is happening again. And the descriptive terms that they use sound very much like what we would talk about in terms of complex trauma, but it's brought up in the context of financial crisis. And I think that's the thing, that for me, my research interest is how are these anxieties manifesting itself in economic events, right? Because in most of those countries, it is the recurrence of the suffering that comes whenever there's a financial crisis, which they have no control over, or very little control really, because it's what happens in our markets here that then has repercussions there. And that's when they bring up this language that actually sounds like they're talking about what here would be trauma, but is not over there recognized as trauma. It is, we're suffering again, we're living through this nightmare again, but they're talking about economics.
As much as I would like to keep going, and I also have a couple of questions, but I think we needed to close the event here, and we have refreshments back there, so we can casually mingle and still continue our discussion. But here, let's close the event, and thank you very much for the guests and panelists.